What are the primary historical or archaeological evidence supporting the claims made by some Hebrew Israelites or groups regarding their direct descendancy from ancient Israelites?
They'll look at ancient inscriptions sometimes of things that are either Semitic or perhaps Israelites in inscriptions. A lot of times it's not clear. We'll say the scholars will say, well, they're Semitic, but we don't know what they are sometimes. And they'll it's almost like power of suggestion, and sometimes it's outright fraud. They'll say, look, that looks like a so-called black man. So sometimes it's just these ancient inscriptions look how we look. Sometimes that's what when you say archaeological evidence. Sometimes it's that. Sometimes they cheat. Now I'm not saying all of them. Some of them they darken images, they alter images, or they point to characters on the wall or whatever thing they're using that are not Semitic or Israelite people, so it's irrelevant. So it just depends as far as that goes. Other times they'll point to things that don't really sound like proof to me at all. These are just the One West style Israelites. Now they'll say, look, here's a Paleo-Hebrew inscription. This is different than the language that the Jews, so-called, use today. They teach and embrace Yiddish. This is what real Hebrew looks like, and now we'll tell you how it sounds like. And so the One West Hebrew Israelites have something called Kalashwan Kodash, Yahweh Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Rakakadash, that they use themselves. That is not standardized Hebrew, where they've basically made the vowel sounds, almost all of them, be the ah sound. Yeah. They'll say, well, that's the way you pronounce that. Paleo-Hebrew is just a script. The square script that modern Jews use today, sometimes called the Assyrian script, it's just a development of the language. Every language, as far as the way it's written, develops. So, the Paleo-Hebrew is more pictographic. But, it doesn't have the vowel pointers that came later. And so the people will say they've essentially used that opportunity to supply their own vocalization, and then they have their essentially an alternative form of Hebrew, and it's not really Hebrew, and that's why a lot of people who know Hebrew hear them speak. They'll say, "What are you saying?" And they'll say, "Well, you don't understand it because you teach Yiddish," and the Hebrew speaker will be like, "No." In fact, I got a clip on that. You want to play the Dr. Brown clip?
Yeah. I'd love to.
So they actually use that as evidence that the way they use it is we're speaking the real Hebrew. These fake Jews is the way they put it. They're not speaking real Hebrew. So who's the real people? That kind of thing. Okay. So there's other examples. The Los Lunas Decalogue. I have a video on that where I interact with some material by the late, great Dr. Heiser. And the Bat Creek Stone. I haven't really done anything on that. And some inscriptions in Newark, Ohio. That they'll say are legitimate. The funny thing is, a lot of them are the same ones that Mormons use to show that Indians supposedly are Hebrews. And I have a blog about that at theshieldSquad.com. If you look at theshieldSquad.com, I have 2 blogs about the Israelite Indian theory, or sometimes called the Hebraic Indian theory, because the One Westers embrace that as well. Okay, let's play this. This is a recent call. Dr. Brown got this call where a One West Hebrew Israelite called, and he began the call by speaking Lashawan Kodash, which is a non-existent form of Hebrew. And Dr. Brown called him out on it, and they had an interesting conversation, if you want to call it that.
Yahweh, who is our Heavenly Father, Bahashem, in the name of Yahweh Shai, who the world so-called ignorantly Jesus Christ.
By the way, can I just say that all your Hebrew pronunciation is 100% wrong according to ancient Hebrew. Just wanted to let you know that 100% grammatically, morphologically wrong. 100% according to ancient Hebrew, which I read fluently.
What makes you think it's wrong?
I know it's wrong because we know vowel structure from the ancient languages.
Okay, so what's your answer to the ancient Hebrew name of our Heavenly Father?
So, Yahweh and Yeshua. Yeshua is fixed. We know that for certain.
That's where you're wrong because there's no Jews in the ancient Hebrew Paleo.
Yes, there is. Of course there is. You're 100% ignorant. Okay? This is my field. I've got a PhD in it. I read it fluently in the original scripts, the original languages. Of course, there's an ooh sound. Absolutely. I can prove it categorically. I can prove it by comparative data from Akkadian. I can prove it with comparative data from other inscriptions. I can prove it from development of the language in Hebrew and Syriac and Aramaic and Arabic, none of which you know, and all of which I know.
They deny modern-day Hebrew as being valid real Hebrew. Okay. They have something they call Lashawan Kodash, supposed to be like pure tongue.
Right, the holy language or something.
And it's based upon the idea that basically every letter only makes one sound. And what they've done is they take out all the vowel vocalizations and make their own speculative vocalization, supposedly based upon Paleo-Hebrew. And a lot of it just becomes the A sound.
Paleo-Hebrew had no vowels, but
so they offer their own speculative vocalizations, which came by way of an angelic vision.
Oh, okay. Well, the angelic vision trumps everything.
So that's a recent clip. That's actually been going around, that clip with Dr. Brown and that caller. And the caller starts it with, I want to say in the name of Yahweh, B'Hashem. And so he gives Lashawan Kodash. And Dr. Brown says, hey, just so you know, your pronunciation's not historical. It's not legitimate. And so the guy starts interacting with it on him. And then he says, well, I didn't call to talk about that anyway. But, here's the background to it. Just before the exile, and I tweeted about this, so I'm looking at one of my own tweets here, because I was looking at a book that collated some information about this, specifically A History of the Hebrew Language by Angel Signs Bedios and Intro to Biblical Hebrew Syntax by Walt K. and O'Connor. And they point out that just before the exile, Hebrew language began using the wa to represent the long O and the U sounds. And if you look at the Siloam inscription around 700, you won't see that. That doesn't have what are called medial vowels. And that's what they're talking about, because he specifically said, there's no U sound. And he said, well, yeah, there was. And then when you look at the letters at Lachish around 587 BC, they do have some medial wa vowels. And what that means is you have this, the U sound being represented by something else. And then by 100 BC, you have these medial vowels being used everywhere at Qumran. Almost whenever there's an opportunity, they're using them. And so this is even before the introduction of the vowel points, the little dots and all that type of stuff that the Masoretes put in. But the Masoretes, they were not adding something that didn't exist. They were representing what Hebrew speakers were already using. But since everybody could no longer supply the vowels when they spoke, they wanted to make sure that there was a way to definitively say, here's the vowel in this set of characters, because it would be consonants only before that. And so my point is that we do have an example of the Hebrew language as it developed, utilizing the U sound, despite what the caller claimed there. And that's what Dr. Brown was saying. And so they'll make claims like that. Now imagine if, you're out on the street, you could become bewildered, because it's like essentially an alternative view of history that these folks hold to,
Correct.
It's an entirely way of looking at everything. And fortunately, Dr. Brown was able to call him out on that. But that's just one of their conspiracy theories. Now, again, most of the conversation we've been having centers on the one West Hebrew Israelites. The Hebrew Israelites who live in Dimona, Israel, the group called the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem, they use standard Hebrew. So not all of them embrace all these conspiracy theories, but they will agree on the basic thesis that Black Americans are Israelites, you know what I mean? But they don't all agree on the other things.
Yeah, so I've been on Clubhouse and I've gotten into some conversations with the Hebrew Israelites. A lot of them I don't see trying to trace their ancestry to like Ethiopia. They're doing something else, which would have been, I suppose, maybe a more natural thing to do that you could have some grounding for, correct?
Yes, in fact, the very first established groups, one of the very first, not the very first, one of the very first established groups in Harlem, New York, established in 1919, called the Commandment Keepers, initially used the language to describe themselves like this: the Royal Order of the Ethiopian Hebrews. So the very first, some of the very first guys, like in Harlem, who got a hold of this. Now, Hebrew Islamism didn't start in Harlem. It grew a lot out of Harlem, but it actually started in the South. And then the people spread the message from Arkansas and Oklahoma to the country, and it grew especially in the East Coast. And then you have Harlem being a growth center. But they actually did use that. And so they would try to tie themselves to Ethiopia. And some of their leaders, some of their rabbis, as they would call them, would take trips to Ethiopia and act as if sort of it was like a covering for them almost. But a lot of Hebrew Israelites since then have dropped that kind of pretense and said, no, that's not what's going on here. That's not what's going on here. And so, one time I had a Hebrew Israelite caller and I said, look, you can't determine your ancestry by a special feeling that you think you get.
Yeah.
And I had a Hebrew Israelite last week do a whole video response on my comment saying, well, vocab's not a spiritual mem. He doesn't get that special feeling, so he doesn't understand. But we do because we know who we are.
Why not just take like ancestry DNA tests?
They will say, most of them, okay, especially the One West variety, they'll say DNA is not an established science. They just wipe it off. They say, well, I don't buy that. It's not valid. It's not valid science. And so they just discount it. They just say it doesn't count as evidence, basically. Now, there is a very small percentage of Hebrew Israelites who get into DNA. Most of them do it sort of illegitimately. They play games with it. Some actually know what they're talking about. One group in particular, they're not a camp. They're more like an internet collective research group called the Yap Gang. They actually know something about DNA. And they disagree with almost all these camps and groups out here. They have a much more nuanced position and understanding. They maybe, I think, often some of their theories, some of it gets kind of complicated. So I'm not acting like I even understand all the nuances of their position within their group. Now, it's a smaller group. I don't want to say they're super influential, but they have some influence because they know what they're talking about to a large degree. But they disagree with almost everything that camps and those guys say. You know, they don't buy into the 12 tribes chart. The 12 tribes chart's insane because regardless of if you agree with DNA or not, you have people on there who on the maternal line, and that's what the Hebrew Israelites count. I'm sorry, did I say paternal? I'm sorry, maternal. I meant to say paternal, excuse me. The father's side, on the paternal line, you have people who have radically different haplogroups smashed together on the 12 tribes chart. And regardless of what you think about long-term DNA studies or not, what that means is that they don't have the same male ancestor. Like definitively, they don't. That's what that means. But they don't care about that. So they'll smash them all. Groups like the Yap Gang, which I said is a smaller kind of minority group, but I appreciate the work they do. They'll say that's nonsense because they know it's nonsense. But a lot of the Hebrews, in fact, Dr. Brown, we just played his clip. He recently debated Guerrilla Hebrew, who's a leader of the Sakari sect. And it was a very good debate, by the way. And they had a brief discussion of DNA, which I think would be interesting. People can watch that on my channel. Just look for Dr. Brown and pull up that debate. And there's a section where they discuss the genetics. And so genetics is not something that most of them use as a legitimate proof. The ones that do play games with it, like Ron Dalton Jr., kind of just, he does a snow job, you know, old term for just lying, basically. And some of the ones who do know what they're talking about, they don't agree with most Hebrew Israelites. That's my perception anyway at this point, and as far as the genetics element.
Okay. So how fringe, by the way, this is a question coming in, that are they a fringe sort of group, or is there a chance that they grow into a large mainstreamish movement?
Well, they are a fringe group, but they've already grown into making inroads into the mainstream. So Kanye West, in those interviews, some of the stuff he was saying was directly influenced by Hebrew Israelism. You know, we're the bloodline of Christ, the tribes of Judah, we're the real Jews, they're Jewish. He said all that stuff. That's all Hebrew Israelite talk.
There's some basketball players, some rappers and basketball players that are...
Yeah. So like Kyrie Irving tweeted the movie by Ron Dalton Jr. that I mentioned. I mentioned him earlier as a DNA, pseudo DNA guy. Kyrie Irving, he now plays for the Dallas Mavericks, retweeted out the link to the Hebrews to Negroes video, which if you watch it, it engages in Holocaust revisionism. It describes Jews in all kinds of, I'll just say, unflattering ways. It has alternative fake history. So, it is anti-Semitic and it is propaganda. It has a fake quote by Hitler that does not exist. Supposedly that Hitler knew who the true Jews were, and that's why he started World War II, and history will one day vindicate him. It shares that as if it's real. So, so that's very mainstream. And that's just some examples. There's actually a bunch of examples when you look around where you say, whoa, this person's into it now. This person's into it now. Fantasia from American Idol, her and her husband, they're in GOCC. That's a Hebrew Israelite group. They promote that stuff. And a lot of other basketball players besides Kyrie have toyed around with it. So it's no longer strictly fringe. So
let me,
and it's
just
growing
before you
fast.
Continue. So Islam seems to be like a large growth kind of thing in prisons. Do we have a similar thing with Hebrew Israelites, and also about Hebrew Israelite growth in Africa? Because I know they've been doing missionary trips in Africa.
Yeah. So Hebrew Israelism is growing in Africa. Now it's usually different versions than the One West version that I've been mainly talking about. It's usually the version that gives the Igbo people basically a wholesale pass to being Israelites. And so that's a big push, and some of the Igbo are buying into it. But a lot of it comes from false hope that honestly some Western missionaries put when they were like, maybe these folks are part of the lost tribes, and that kind of got circulated in the water. And then years later, Hebrew Israelites come and kind of re-stir that. And some people are like, hey, we're the real Israelites. So the Igbo pushing folks are not the One West folks. What the One West folks do when they go visit, like IUIC, they'll go visit, say, Ghana or Freetown, Sierra Leone. They're looking for people who still fulfill the curses in the proper way, because, by the way, the way that they determine they're Israelites is they fulfill the curses, supposedly, of Deuteronomy 28. So they say the way we know we're Israel is because we're getting punished like Israel, basically, right? They are looking for Israelites who are not Hamitic, but are Semitic. So a One West understanding of Africa is a lot of it's Hamites, but there are Semites mixed in who may look somewhat similar. This is their lingo, but whose spirit is different, or maybe whose family history or story is different. And the way you find out is who accepts the message, basically. And so it is growing. So there's videos. If you put Hebrew Israelite Africa and Google around, you'll find pictures and videos of these guys out in the markets in certain cities in Africa preaching, sounding just like a guy on the corner of 19th Avenue and Campbell back here in Phoenix. But yet now they've adopted this. Now that's the One West style. They have a different version than the Igbo pushers. But some of them go down to South Africa, like Ron Dalton. I mentioned him several times. I think he moved to South Africa because he has another conspiracy theory. Guess what it is? He teaches that Israel is actually in Africa. So Jerusalem is not located in the Middle East. It's located there. And so it's a conspiracy of geography as well. But it's some pretty wild stuff there.
Y'all can go check out. You should go check out the work that Vocab does. All social media platforms, YouTube, Instagram, all that.